All right, good. Thanks for that kind introduction. I'm really excited and honored to be invited to present as part of this series. Let's see if I can get my PowerPoint going. I'm going to read the paper as I have it prepared, but I have a PowerPoint so you guys can follow along. Okay. So the title of the talk is Forms and Matters, Classical versus Contemporary Hylomorphism. And that sounds a bit more antagonistic than it's actually going to turn out to be. As we'll go through my talk, you'll see that I think that contemporary hylomorphists can learn a lot from classical hylomorphism, but also that classical hylomorphists can benefit from learning about what's going on in contemporary discussions. So it'd be more like classical and contemporary hylomorphism, or classical plus contemporary hylomorphism, something like that, right? Okay. So here's a brief outline of the talk. First, I'm going to give a brief history of hylomorphism. Then I'm going to describe what I take to be the basic motivations for hylomorphism, definitely from a sort of a contemporary sort of standpoint. Why would contemporary philosophers take hylomorphism seriously? Why are they interested in it? And then I'll give an overview of some of the main disputed questions, the main topics that are in the debate of contemporary hylomorphism. And then I'll take a closer look at two main varieties of contemporary hylomorphism, one called structural hylomorphism and the other one called dispositional hylomorphism. And then I'm going to take sort of a bold step and propose my own sort of third option as a contemporary view of material objects, one that draws from classical hylomorphism, but also is in conversation with contemporary hylomorphism, this view that I call Hyloenergeism or Hyloenergism, but I prefer Hyloenergeism. And then I'll conclude. So that's the outline of the talk. Okay. First, a brief history of hylomorphism. Hylomorphism, from the Greek words hyle, meaning matter, and morphe, meaning form, is the theory according to which, within a specified domain, the entities within that domain are best understood as comprised or composed of two fundamental parts, components, aspects, or principles, matter and form. Hylomorphism was first introduced as a theory of the natural world by Aristotle, though as some recent scholars have noted, there are some strong hylomorphic elements in the thought of Plato as well. Aristotle introduced the theory of hylomorphism in his Physics as a theoretical framework for explaining physical change. Aristotle used this hylomorphic framework to explain how change is possible, to identify when and why change occurs, and to classify the various types of changes we see in the world. In later works, he extended his hylomorphic theory of change to offer detailed analyses of various phenomena in chemistry and on generation and corruption, biology and on the soul, and cosmology in the later books of the metaphysics. During the medieval period, hylomorphism became the dominant view. Medieval scholastics advanced sophisticated hylomorphic theories of the natural world and used the language of form and matter to articulate and elucidate various theological doctrines. Throughout this period, there were ongoing debates concerning the scope of hylomorphism, such as whether immaterial substances, such as angels and the human soul, also admit of a hylomorphic analysis, and the internal hylomorphic structure of living substances, most notably concerning how many forms are present within each living body, one or several. At the start of the early modern period, with the rise of modern science, notions of form and matter were abandoned in favor of more empirically adequate mechanistic explanations. As the story goes, the early moderns liberated philosophy from the constraints of the Aristotelian worldview and laid the groundwork for a more scientifically informed, mechanistic, reductionist alternative. For centuries afterward, the theory of hylomorphism was seen by the majority of philosophers as obscure, unmotivated, and outdated. Recently, however, there has been a revival of interest in Aristotelian and neo-Aristotelian approaches to various issues in contemporary analytic philosophy. And within that revival, hylomorphism too has made something of a comeback. Hylomorphic views have been reintroduced into various contemporary debates within the subdisciplines of logic, mereology, ontology of the human person, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and philosophy of religion, among others. True, not everyone is on board with hylomorphism. There have also been several new critiques of hylomorphism, some critical of the theory's intended scope, others critical of certain features of particular versions of the theory, and some critical even of its most basic claims. But the fact that authors have felt the need to offer new critiques of the theory suggests that hylomorphism is being taken seriously once more. Contemporary discussions of hylomorphism have found philosophers revisiting classic points of contention concerning the theory's scope, application, and utility. It has also led philosophers to carefully reconsider how best to understand hylomorphism's most basic claims. What is form? What is matter? How are we to understand the relationship between form and matter in a given object? What does it mean for something to be composed or comprised of matter and form? What sorts of things admit of a hylomorphic analysis? Why should we accept a hylomorphic analysis of these entities? Why think that we need both matter and form to explain the existence and nature of the objects in question? One of the areas in which hylomorphism has received the most attention is as a theory of material objects. Here, hylomorphism is specified as the theory according to which material objects, or certain material objects, are best understood as composed or comprised of both matter and form. And there are many different varieties of hylomorphic theories of material objects currently on offer. The varieties of contemporary hylomorphism can be distinguished from one another in several ways, in terms of how they understand the relationship between form and matter, in terms of how they understand the relationship between form, matter, and the material objects that they comprise or compose, in terms of how they understand the scope or extent of hylomorphic analysis, and in terms of how they understand the basic building blocks of the theory, that is, in terms of how they understand the basic notions of form and matter. I think that it is helpful to distinguish varieties of contemporary hylomorphism in terms of their understanding of form. And I think that we can divide varieties of contemporary hylomorphism this way into roughly three camps. Many contemporary proponents of a hylomorphic theory of material objects endorse a version according to which the form of a material object is a certain kind of complex relation, configuration, organization, or structure realized in its material parts. Following David Oderberg, let's call this approach structural hylomorphism. Others endorse a version according to which the form of a material object is a certain kind of power or disposition continuously activated in the object or in its material parts. Let's call this approach dispositional hylomorphism. In my own work, I have argued against structural and dispositional varieties of hylomorphism in favor of a third approach that I call Hyloenergeism, according to which the form of a material object is best understood as a certain kind of activity or process in which the object or its parts are continuously engaged. But before saying a little more about my own project, I would first like to do two things. First, I would like to begin by providing an overview of some of the basic motivations for hylomorphism. Second, I would like to present a more detailed overview of some of the main points of discussion in the contemporary literature on hylomorphism and some of the main hylomorphic views currently on offer. So the basic motivations for hylomorphism. Why accept a hylomorphic theory of material objects in the first place? Why think that we need to bring in notions of matter and form to explain the existence and nature of any of the objects of our experience? That every material object is comprised or composed of some kind of matter seems obvious, but why think that material objects are also comprised or composed of some kind of form? I think that it is helpful to think of form as an explanatory posit, introduced to explain certain features found in material objects that cannot, or cannot easily, be accounted for solely by means of their material constituents. Proponents of hylomorphism have cited several such features, and thus there are several key explanatory roles that form is meant to play in a hylomorphic theory of material objects. As mentioned earlier, Aristotle first introduced his hylomorphic theory of material objects to provide a theoretical framework that could help to explain the various sorts of changes we observe in the natural world. And many contemporary philosophers continue to see its ability to explain change and the persistence of material objects through change as one of the primary virtues of the theory. Here's the basic idea. It's common for material objects to undergo various sorts of changes with respect to their material parts. An object can lose parts, gain parts, or swap parts with other objects. Indeed, the metabolic processes of living organisms require that they undergo these sorts of changes constantly. On the one hand, sometimes when a material object undergoes changes in its material parts, it survives those changes. It is still the very same material object with which we began. So, for example, if I were to replace the chain on my bicycle, it seems that it would remain the very same bicycle, just with the new chain. On the other hand, sometimes, even when all of the parts of a material object are retained, the object itself is not. The material object with which we started is no longer there. So, for example, if I were to take a hammer to my mother's favorite vase, the material parts of that vase would still be there on the table, but the vase will have been destroyed. If an object can remain the very same object despite not possessing the very same material parts it had before, then that must mean that there is some further part, component, or aspect to the object that ensures its survival through those changes in those parts. And if the parts of a material object can remain despite the fact that the object that they once composed no longer exists, then that must mean that there is some further part, component, or aspect to that object that is now missing. This further part, component, or aspect that is present in the first case and missing in the second is what hylomorphists call the object's form. Form is also introduced to account for the internal unity we observe in many of the objects of our experience. Here's the basic idea. Many of the objects of our experience appear to be more than just sets or heaps or loose collections of their parts. For example, if I were to simply pour out the contents of the box for my new dining room table from IKEA, I would not yet have a dining room table. There is something else I must do or add to those contents before I have a dining room table, something which can bring those parts together and unify them into one singular whole, rather than merely a set, heap, collection, or plurality of things. That something else that I must do or add to those contents before I have a dining room table is what hylomorphists call the object's form. Understanding form as the principle of unity within a material object, the principle that brings those parts together and unifies them into a singular whole, also allows hylomorphism to provide an intuitively plausible, moderate answer to what is known in contemporary discussions as the special composition question. The special composition question asks, when or under what circumstances do some smaller material objects make up or compose some larger composite material object? To provide an answer to this question is to provide an account of when and where composition occurs. As the sizable literature on this topic reveals, there are a wide variety of answers on offer, and thus a variety of theories of material composition. But here we can reduce them to 4 main answers, and I'll give a brief rundown of the debate on this topic. Never, always, just once, and sometimes. Mereological nihilists say that composition never occurs. According to mereological nihilism, there are no composite material objects. The only material objects that exist are simple particles, which never make up anything larger than themselves. On this view, there are no tables, trees, or even human beings, only simple particles in table, tree, and human-like arrangements. Mereological universalists say that composition always occurs. According to mereological universalism, for every possible combination of material objects, there is some further composite material object composed of just those material objects. On this view, tables, trees, and human beings exist, but so do things like shoe tower moon, an object composed of my left shoe, the Eiffel Tower, and the moon. Mereological monists say that composition occurs just once, the only composite material object, and indeed on some varieties of monism, the only object at all that exists is that which includes every other thing, the whole cosmos. A moderate answer to the special composition question is any answer that says that material objects sometimes, but not always, compose something larger than themselves. And there are many different ways of fleshing out a moderate answer, many ways of spelling out precisely when and where and how composition occurs. Hylomorphism provides a formal explanation of composition. A hylomorphic theory of material objects says that smaller material objects make up or compose some further composite material object when and only when there is some form that unifies them. Or to put it another way, there is some composite material object present when and only when there is some form present in some matter. Thus, on a hylomorphic theory of material objects, the everyday objects of our experience really do exist, but random collections of objects, such as shoe tower moons, do not, assuming that objects such as my left shoe, the Eiffel Tower, and the moon bear no interesting formal relations to one another. And that seems like the right result. Finally, positing the existence of forms also helps to provide a theory of natural kinds. Material objects are the kinds of objects that they are and possess the characteristic features, capacities, and tendencies that they do, not only because of the kinds of material parts that they possess, but also because of the particular formal features realized in those parts. This becomes most apparent when we reflect on the fact that different kinds of objects can be composed of the very same kind of matter. Think back to my IKEA dining room table example. Earlier, we observed that simply pouring out the contents of the box will not give me a dining room table. I need to give those contents some form. And even more than that, I need to give them the right form. If I were to give them the wrong form, then I might end up with a composite material object of a very different sort, such as a desk, or a chair, or a work of abstract art. All these objects that I could compose with the contents of the box from IKEA would be composed of all the very same material parts, but they'd be very different kinds of objects, with very different features and capacities that would enable them to serve many different functions. The fundamental difference between these different objects, the difference that gives rise to the differences in their kind and in their particular features, capacities, and functions, is the difference in their form. In summary, the basic motivations for a hylomorphic theory of material objects are as follows. Form can help to explain both the synchronic, at a time, and diachronic, across time, identity of material objects. It can help to explain how a composite material object can be one thing despite being composed of many parts, and how it can remain the same thing over time despite changes in those parts. Form provides the basic framework for an intuitively plausible, moderate answer to the special composition question. And form can help to provide a theory of natural kinds. It can help us to explain why material objects come in different kinds and why they possess the characteristic features and capacities and tendencies that they do. While considered on their own, none of these motivations for hylomorphism is likely to convince anyone who isn't already convinced that hylomorphism is true. Together, they offer a powerful cumulative case. It is easy to see why many are attracted to the view. As a theory of material objects, it has a lot going for it. Okay. Now, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot about what hylomorphism is, what sorts of ontological commitments it carries with it, or what a hylomorphic theory of material objects might actually look like. So let's return to some of those basic questions about hylomorphism that I mentioned above. The starting point for any inquiry concerning the theory of hylomorphism is to ask about the 2 main terms in its formulation. To what do these 2 terms refer? What exactly is a form, and what do we mean by matter? In contemporary discussions of hylomorphism, there are a wide variety of understandings of these two terms on offer. With respect to form, we can further distinguish between three more specific questions that can help us get a better understanding of its nature. First, we can ask, what kind of thing is a form? To what ontological category does it belong? And with respect to this first question, there are, once again, a variety of options available. Some authors take the form of a material object to be a certain kind of property possessed by the object or jointly possessed by its parts, or a certain kind of relation that its parts bear to one another. Others take it to be a configuration or organization or structure of the parts. Others take the form of a material object to be a kind of power or disposition continuously activated in its matter. Others take it to be a certain kind of fact or function. Still others take the form of a material object to be a kind of process or activity occurring in its matter. And some take the form of a material object to be extrinsic to the object that possesses it. According to this last approach, the form of a material object is identified with a certain response, intention, purpose, or creative act, formed or performed by some human agent or group of human agents. The second question we can ask about form is whether forms are themselves simple or complex. Some authors consider forms to be ontologically simple, completely lacking in any kind of internal composition or complexity, whereas others consider forms to be composite entities, themselves composed of other objects, properties, relations, or powers. Finally, we can ask where forms fall on the universal particular divide. There are ongoing discussions about whether the form of a material object should be understood as a shareable, multiply instantiated universal, an individuated trope-like particular, or something beyond both. With respect to matter, there are three main views on offer. Some authors, following a traditional line of thought that runs through Aristotle and several of his medieval commentators, say that the matter of a material object is a kind of formless substrate, a foundational layer of pure potentiality that underlies all of physical reality. Others say that matter is a kind of infinitely divisible, non-particulate stuff, which comes in designated portions, but is otherwise characterless. Still others say that the matter of a material object is just the smaller material objects of which it is composed, objects which are themselves hylomorphically complex. Concerning this last approach, there are ongoing discussions about whether hylomorphists should hold that material objects are infinitely divisible into smaller and smaller hylomorphically complex parts, or that reality bottoms out at partless simples, indivisible philosophical atoms which are not themselves comprised or composed of matter and form. Another important question one can ask about the theory of hylomorphism concerns the relationship between the matter, the form, and the object which is said to be composed or comprised of matter and form. What does it mean for an object to be composed or comprised of both matter and form? Are matter and form to be understood as parts or components or constituents of the object? If so, is the form of a material object a part of that object in the same way that its material parts are? Or is it a part or component or constituent in a different sense? Some authors do indeed take matter and form to be parts or components or constituents of the objects that they compose. Some even take the form of an object to be a part of that object in the very same way that its material parts are. Other authors reject a mereological construal of hylomorphism, arguing that form is best understood not as some further part, component, or constituent of an object, but as an essential aspect, feature, or organizing principle of that object. There are also several key questions we can ask about the relationship between a hylomorphic compound and its material parts. Are hylomorphic wholes grounded in their material parts, deriving their existence and identity from the material objects that make them up? Or are the material parts of a hylomorphic compound grounded in the whole, such that those parts derive their existence and identity from the object they compose? Is a hylomorphic composite an emergent entity, something over and above the material parts on which it depends? Or is a hylomorphic composite best understood as ontologically prior to its parts, in such a way that each of its parts depends for its existence and identity on the whole? Traditionally, hylomorphism was seen as committed to the latter understanding. That is, it was taken to be committed to the claim that hylomorphic wholes are ontologically prior to their parts, at least for certain kinds of wholes and certain kinds of parts. And several contemporary hylomorphists have defended this, what I call the submergentist approach. Others have defended emergentist, bottom-up approaches. And still others have defended more reductionist approaches, according to which composite material objects, despite being in some sense composed or comprised of both matter and form, are reducible to and ultimately nothing more than their parts. Many contemporary discussions concerning hylomorphism have to do with its scope. What sorts of things admit of a hylomorphic analysis? Are all material objects composed or comprised of both matter and form, or are only some material objects hylomorphically complex? Can a hylomorphic analysis be extended beyond the material? Naturally, contemporary authors are less concerned about whether souls or angels admit of a hylomorphic analysis, but there is some discussion about whether it can be applied to the realm of abstracta, that is, whether properties or propositions should also be understood as composed or comprised of something akin to matter and something akin to form. Now moving on to taking a closer look at this view that I've called structural hylomorphism. The central notion in any hylomorphic theory of the world is the notion of form. But what is a form? To what ontological category do forms belong? Is the form of a material object a property, power, or relation, or is it something else entirely? Is the form of a material object simple or complex? Is it universal or particular? Are forms parts or components or constituents in the material objects that possess them, or are they merely additional features or aspects or principles of those objects? What are the major roles that form is meant to play in a hylomorphic theory of material objects, and why should we think that there are such things in the first place? The project of contemporary hylomorphism can be seen as the attempt by contemporary analytic philosophers to provide plausible and informative answers to these questions. But as we've seen, contemporary hylomorphists disagree on how we should answer them. As I explained above, the various forms of contemporary hylomorphism can be divided into roughly three camps, though there are some that fall outside of these three camps. Those who think of form in relational or structural terms, those who think of form in dispositional and functional terms, and those who think of form in irreducibly dynamic terms. Let's now take a closer look at each of these three main approaches. So one way to better understand what the form of a material object is supposed to be in a hylomorphic theory of material objects, one which might also help to explain why we should think that there are such things in the first place, is to focus on the structural features found within an object. We could start by describing the object's shape or figure, the internal arrangement, organization, or configuration of its parts, or the specific causal and spatial relations that those parts bear to one another. Indeed, many contemporary proponents of hylomorphism have argued that this is all there is to form. The form of a material object just is a complex polyadic relation or structure realized in its material parts. This is the approach that I've called, following David Oderberg, structural hylomorphism. And some of its proponents include Mark Johnson, Kit Fine, Catherine Kozlicki, and William Jaworski, among others. So the first thing to say about structural hylomorphism is that it does capture many of the motivations for hylomorphism discussed above. It offers a simple, straightforward, and intuitively plausible strategy for resisting the ontological reduction of composite material objects to nothing more than the material parts, one which allows for a suitably restricted theory of composition, and one which helps to account for the internal unity we observe in many of the objects of our experience. According to structural hylomorphism, material objects are not simply their matter. Composite material objects arise when and only when their matter is arranged, organized, or structured in a particular way. Structural hylomorphism also offers a systematic approach to natural kinds. On this account, material objects belong to the kinds that they do and possess the characteristic features and capacities that they do because of the particular arrangement, organization, or structure that is realized in their matter. Nonetheless, there are several concerns that could be raised for structural hylomorphism. First, structural hylomorphists would appear to be committed to a certain sort of systematic causal overdetermination. Here's the basic idea. Structures and relations seem to be the sorts of things that, when added to some previously existing materials, do not significantly alter the existence, identity, or behavior of those materials. For example, when I assemble the parts of my dining room table, the parts are still there, and they appear to have undergone no significant change in their identity or behavior, despite now composing something larger than themselves, that is, the dining room table. But if that's right, then in any case of hylomorphic composition, the result is that we now have at least two things in front of us: the new composite whole and the previously existing material objects that now serve as its parts. And this is where the threat of systematic causal overdetermination comes in. Anything done by or done to the dining room table is now done by or done to two numerically distinct, is to say, non-identical things: the composite whole and its parts. In order to avoid having too many causal agents or too many causal patients in the picture, structural hylomorphists will have to say that the whole doesn't really cause anything. Each of its actions is just a result of its parts acting in concert. But then composite wholes, which importantly will include things like plants, animals, and human beings, turn out to be either causally redundant or entirely epiphenomenal, having no causal efficacy whatsoever. Composite wholes, the existence of which structural hylomorphists have worked so hard to motivate, end up making no causal difference in the world whatsoever, lest their effects be causally overdetermined by their parts. A second concern for structural hylomorphism is that it seems incapable of explaining identity over time for more dynamically complex material objects, such as living organisms. Living organisms seem to undergo and survive various structural changes over the course of their existence. Consider my cat Nico. Nico was once a small, frail kitten that we rescued from beneath the hood of a truck. Later on, Nico got bigger and stronger, faster and smarter. He ate, drank, shed his fur, and in an unfortunate accident, lost most of its tail. That's a true story. Nico still has black fur, but most of his other features have changed over time. In addition, Nico has by now shuffled through various material parts at a rapid rate, such that none that he once had now remain a part of him. It seems clear that over the course of his life, Nico has survived a change in not only his material parts, but also in several of the structural features that his material parts have exhibited throughout his life. Nico got taller and heavier, recovered from various maladies, picked up new behavioral tendencies, and later on, sadly, lost his tail. Though my cat Nico exhibits a very similar structure to that which his material parts exhibited earlier on, it seems implausible to suggest that it is the very same structure. What this example seems to show, then, that it is not by virtue of the continued possession of some complex relation or structure that living organisms like my cat Nico remain the same over time. As a result, for these sorts of material objects, structural approaches to understand the nature of form seem not to capture the form's traditional role as the guarantor of diachronic identity. In light of these and other concerns, some contemporary hylomorphists have looked to provide a more dynamic conception of form, either by expanding the notion of structure so as to permit alterations in particular relations that hold in any particular time, or by adopting an alternative non-structural approach. One of the leading non-structural approaches to understanding the nature of form is the powers approach, according to which the form of a material object is a certain kind of power or disposition continuously activated in the object or in its material parts. I call this approach dispositional hylomorphism, and its proponents include Michael Ray, William Jaworski in more recent works, Anna Mormodoro, and Graham Renz, among others. So like structural hylomorphism, dispositional hylomorphism provides an intuitively plausible restricted theory of composition. According to dispositional hylomorphism, not every set of objects composes some further object. On this account, for any set of objects, the members of that set compose some further object if and only if those objects jointly actualize, manifest, realize, or instantiate some particular power or disposition. Dispositional hylomorphism's restricted theory of composition also points to its ability to offer a systematic approach to natural kinds. Like structural hylomorphists, dispositional hylomorphists take the dispositions or powers that serve as the forms of material objects to be not only kind-specific, but kind-specifying. That is, any particular object is the kind of object that it is because of the particular power or disposition that is jointly activated, manifested, or realized in its parts. The principal advantage of dispositional hylomorphism over structural hylomorphism is that it better captures the dynamic complexity of certain types of material objects, such as living organisms. And the key feature that allows dispositional hylomorphism to achieve this is that powers or dispositions are multiply realizable. The same power or disposition can be realized or manifested by different types of objects in different types of structures or arrangements. For example, different types of mental states or dispositions can be realized in different types of materials or in different types of brain structures. As a result, dispositional hylomorphists can explain how dynamically complex material objects can undergo and survive certain types of changes, perhaps even radical changes in their material constituents and in the particular relations or structures realized in those material constituents over time. As long as whatever parts the object has continue to manifest or realize the relevant power or disposition, then changes in their material parts or the structural arrangements of their material parts pose no problem for the identity of that object over time. Nonetheless, there is one key concern that I would like to raise for dispositional hylomorphism. What really seems to be doing the unificatory and explanatory work in dispositional approaches to understanding the nature of form is not the possession or presence of a particular power or set of powers, but the manifestation of that power or set of powers. It is not any particular power that unites the parts of any whole at a time and over time. It is the joint manifestation of some power that they possess, some joint activity in which those parts are engaged. In short, what unites the parts of any whole is not something that they can do, but something that they are doing. Form is, after all, a kind of act, not a kind of potency. So now we shift to the really bold and interesting stuff where I offer sort of a third alternative to those two major contemporary versions of hylomorphism. So the account of material objects that I have been working up to brings together elements from a variety of sources, several of them now familiar: traditional Aristotelian hylomorphism, structural hylomorphism, and dispositional hylomorphism, but also contemporary discussions on the nature of occurrences or happenings, especially those that focus on the nature of activities or processes, and various occurrence-based theories of material objects found in the contemporary literature. The account that I would like to propose is built on three main claims. First, the proposed account is a version of hylomorphism in that it holds that material objects are best understood as comprised or composed of two fundamental parts, components, or aspects, both matter and form. Second, the proposed account is a version of mereological hylomorphism in that it holds that the principal formal aspect of any material object is included among its metaphysical parts or constituents. Thirdly, and most importantly, the proposed hylomorphic account of material objects is a version of dynamic hylomorphism, in that it rejects relational, structural, and dispositional conceptions of form. On the proposed account, the principal formal component of any material substance, its substantial form, is not to be identified with any kind of relation, structure, organization, arrangement, or configuration of its material constituents. It is also not to be identified with any kind of property, power, or disposition possessed by the whole or realized in its parts. The present account does not deny the existence of relations, structures, properties, powers, or dispositions, but it does insist that none of these categories properly captures the fundamental nature of form. According to the proposed account, the fundamental nature of form can only be properly captured by thinking of the form of a material substance as, or something very much like, an activity or process that its matter is participating in or undergoing. Following Mark Steen, I call this approach Hyloenergeism, drawing from the Greek words hule, meaning matter, and energeia, meaning activity. In short, Hyloenergeism is the view that all material objects are composite of matter and activity, with activity playing the role of form. So before discussing what I see as the main upshots of Hyloenergeism, let me say just a little more about the view itself. According to Hyloenergeism, at the heart of every material substance is a certain core activity or process which makes it what it is, preserves its identity over time, and bestows upon it its species-specific features and capacities. Importantly, the proposed account does not identify any material substance with the activity or process on which it depends for its existence identity. This is not a sort of a process philosophy. Rather, a material substance is best understood as a hylomorphic composite, composed of both matter and form, which exists as long as that activity or process is continually realized in some suitable matter. But what is an activity? What is the notion of process operative in this account? I think that a good place to start is with the initial observation that activities and processes belong to a larger category of being, which we might refer to as the category of occurrence. I told you that this is going to be the bold and exciting part of the presentation. Okay, so occurrences are those things that occur, happen, take place, are done, or go on. The category of occurrence includes things such as events, processes, states, accomplishments, achievements, performances, and activities. By referring to these things as occurrences, I mean to distinguish them from members of other standard ontological categories, such as objects, stuffs, properties, powers, and relations. Activities or processes are those occurrences that are indicated linguistically by the gerundive form of a verb in the progressive aspect, which is to say that they are indicated by verbs ending in ing and describe occurrences that were, are, or will be in progress. Walking, falling, and thinking, for example, are all activities or processes. Hyloenergeism understands activity or processes to be inherently dynamic. For something to undergo a process is for that thing to change in various ways. It also understands activities or processes to be concrete particulars, countable individuals that persist through time. The most controversial aspect of Hyloenergeism's understanding of activities or processes is that they are best understood not as perduring entities, but as a uniquely enduring species of occurrence. Here's the basic idea. The most common approach to understand the nature of processes is one according to which a process is a series or succession of events or changes united to one another by certain causal relations. Call this the succession model. On the succession model, a process is a complex occurrence made up of smaller, more basic occurrences, which are taken to be events or changes. There is, however, an alternative approach to understand the nature of processes found in the contemporary literature. According to this alternative approach, championed by Roland Stout, Helen Stewart, and others, processes are not in any way comprised of successive stages. For any given process, there will be stages of that process, but these stages are not to be construed as parts of the process. As Stout explains, these stages are manifestations of the underlying process that are happening and temporal parts of the resultant event. Processes themselves are completely lacking in such temporal parts. They are, according to Stout, whole or complete at every moment during which they exist or occur. What sets processes apart from events, then, is that a process can be said to endure through time, serving as the subject of different properties at different times, whereas an event can only be said to perdure, possessing different properties at different times by virtue of being composed of several different stages, each of which is the primary possessor of one of the relevant properties. According to Stout, then, processes are best understood not as temporally extended perduring entities, but as a current continuance. And it is upon this understanding of the nature of processes that Hyloenergeism is built. And indeed, the view is called Hyloenergeism because I'm focusing here on Aristotle's own account, the distinction between energeia and kinesis. Energeias are those sorts of occurrences or activities or processes which are complete or finished sort of at every moment. They are sort of ongoing, but not in the sense of being stretched out or incomplete. They're complete at every moment, but they may sort of like continue to occur. Okay. Okay, good. Talked about that. Okay. The enduring activities or processes that serve as the forms of material objects on this account place three central rules. First, activities or processes are kind-specific and kind-specifying. A material object is a member of its kind or species because its matter is undergoing a certain type of activity or process. And members of distinct kinds or species can be distinguished from one another by their qualitatively distinct activities or processes. That is to say, by the particular changes occurring in the matter and the particular ends to which those activities or processes are directed. The second major role that activities or processes play in this account is as a principle of synchronic unity in a composite material object. A material object is one thing by virtue of the singular activity or process in which its material parts are engaged. And it is only when those material parts are collectively engaged in the relevant activity or process that they compose something larger than themselves. Finally, activities or processes are also the principle of dichronic unity in a material object. On a hyloenergeic account of material objects, a material object is numerically the same material object at two different times by virtue of its matter being continuously engaged in the same activity or process throughout. I see two major advantages of a hyloenergeic approach to form, at least in comparison to the two other leading approaches. First, I think that it lends itself to a more transformationalist account of hylomorphic composition, one that might help us to avoid any kind of systematic causal overdetermination. According to Hyloenergeism, the form of a material substance is a certain activity or process that its matter is undergoing. And this activity or process is such that no material object that participates in it can cease to participate in it without thereby ceasing to exist. According to Hyloenergeism, then, to introduce an entirely new activity or process in some matter is to introduce in that matter an entirely new material substance. And so by virtue of coming to participate in an entirely new activity or process, a material substance must cease to exist, or at least cease to be the material substance that it was, and be replaced by a new material substance whose identity is essentially grounded in that new activity or process. Likewise, when two or more material substances come to jointly participate in some entirely new activity or process, all of those material substances must cease to exist, or at least cease to be the material substances that they were, and be replaced by a new composite material substance whose identity is essentially grounded in that new activity or process. In a hyloenergeic ontology, to change what a material substance principally does, to change the principal occurrence that is taking place in its matter, is to change what the material substance principally is. And so what it takes to bring a numerically distinct composite whole into existence is for a number of material substances to jointly participate in an entirely new activity or process, then it follows from the basic claims of hyloenergeism that those substances must cease to exist, or at least cease to be what they were upon the whole's creation. Such a transformation will mean that the previously existing materials from which any hylomorphic composite comes to be do not actually compete with the resulting whole for its causal agency, either because those materials have ceased to exist, have fused or merged into the whole, or as part of their transformation, they have surrendered their causal powers and thus their causal agency to the whole of which they are now parts. The second advantage of hyloenergeism has to do with identity over time. As I explained above, a significant limitation of structural approaches to understand the nature of form is that they seem unable to account for the fact that more dynamically complex material objects, such as living organisms, seem to undergo and survive various structural changes over the course of their existence. On a hyloenergeic account of material objects, on the other hand, a material object is numerically the same material object at two different times by virtue of its matter being continuously engaged in the same activity or process throughout. And this allows for more flexible, persistent conditions. First, the activity or process in which a material object's matter is engaged is not in any way identical to, composed of, or essentially dependent upon any particular material parts that the material object possesses at any time. As a result, an activity or process can admit of various changes in the matter that participates in it. Intuitively, activities and processes do seem to have this sort of flexibility. The flowing of a river, for example, can involve millions of water molecules over even a short amount of time. And the singing of a choir can incorporate different singers at different times. A conception of form according to which the form of a material object is an activity or process, then, can rather straightforwardly accommodate material change. The activity or process in which a material object's matter is engaged is also not in any way identical to, composed of, or essentially dependent upon any particular structural features that are realized in the material parts that the material substance possesses at any time. As a result, the activities or processes that serve as the forms of material objects in this account can also commit of various changes in the spatial and causal relations that hold between an object's parts. Intuitively, activities and processes do seem to have this sort of flexibility. When a group of people are dancing, for example, that dancing will involve various arrangements and configurations of the dancers over time. And the very same process of burning that a building undergoes when it catches fire may carry on through the building's collapse. Indeed, many activities or processes with which we are familiar seem to require that the participants undergo various changes in their relational and structural features. Two teams cannot be playing baseball, for example, unless they are alternating sides at least every inning. I submit then that a conception of form, according to which the form of a material object is an activity or process, can accommodate structural change as well. Okay, maybe I'll jump to the conclusion. Hyloenergeism is at this point merely at the beginning stages of a research program. There are several issues that remain to be resolved and several problems that remain to be addressed, many of which I bet astute audience members will bring to my attention in the Q&A. It looks like the chat is lighting up already. But what I hope to have shown is that Hyloenergeism is a promising research program, one worth further investigation. It offers a dynamic, irreducibly teleological conception of material substances with a bold, transformative account of hylomorphic composition. It is amenable to classical Aristotelian notions such as prime matter and substantial form, substantial and accidental change, substance and artifact. It solves or avoids several key concerns for other leading hylomorphic views. And indeed, given their emphasis on living organisms as the paradigm case of what it is to be a material substance, Hyloenergeism may even be what Aristotle and St. Thomas had in mind all along. Thank you for your attention.